This story is a work of historical fiction, inspired by events, cultural practices, and environments of the 19th century Utah Territory. While it references the Mormon community and themes of polygamy, secrecy, and religious control, it does not claim to represent actual historical individuals or official beliefs. The narrative blends real-world context with fictionalized characters and events, and should not be taken as factual history. Its purpose is creative storytelling, exploring power, faith, fear, and survival in a dramatic setting. The days in the household moved slowly, measured not by clocks, but by chores and prayers. Each wife knew her role in the rhythm of the home, though no one had ever spoken it aloud. Sarah, the first wife, moved with the authority of a matriarch, commanding respect through quiet glances and the sharp edge of her silence. She was not cruel, but she held the weight of long years and the certainty that survival came only through obedience. Clara often wondered what Sarah had once been like before the desert, before the covenant, before being claimed by a man who already belonged to many. Now she seemed like stone shaped by endless wind, her softness long worn away. Mary, the second wife, was different. There was a gentleness about her that persisted despite the hardships. Her hands were always busy, sewing or tending to the children, yet she carried a sadness that seemed stitched into her very being. Clara sometimes caught her staring into the fire, her lips moving in silent words, prayers, perhaps, or memories of a life she once had. Though Mary never spoke openly of rebellion, her silence carried its own defiance, as if she clung to fragments of selfhood even when she could not act upon them. Ruth was fire contained in human form. She was younger than Sarah and Mary, but older than Clara, and her eyes always burned with questions she dared not voice too loudly. Clara sensed in her a kind of restless energy, a spirit that did not yield easily to control. Ruth's laughter, when it came, was sharp, edged with bitterness. Sometimes she would press her lips close to Clara's ear and whisper things she should not, suspicions about the covenant, doubts about the elders, thoughts of escape. But always, after speaking, she would look over her shoulder, her face tightening with fear. The walls had ears, she would say, and in this place silence was the only true protection. Clara felt herself suspended among them, part of the household but also apart. Her presence was both tolerated and hidden, for she was the secret wife, the one no one could speak of openly. She lived in a half-existence, called upon when needed, ignored when inconvenient. Sometimes she wondered if the others resented her or pitied her, but no one said. They simply worked side by side, moving like shadows in the routines demanded of them. At night, the husband, Elder Nathaniel, would move from room to room, his presence both expected and dreaded. To the outside world, he was a respected leader, a man of faith and conviction. Inside the home, he was an authority to be obeyed, and his word was law. Clara had learned quickly not to resist, not to speak unless spoken to. Her body was no longer hers to command, but she told herself her mind could still remain her own. It was a small defiance, but it was all she had. The children of the first wives added another layer of complexity to the household. Sarah's oldest son was nearly a man himself, already learning the duties of faith and preparing to take on responsibilities in the community. He looked at Clara with suspicion, as though sensing she was more than what she appeared. Mary's daughters, gentle and quiet, sometimes slipped into Clara's room in secret, asking her to tell stories of the East. She spoke softly of rivers and fields, of trees that changed color with the seasons, of carriages and lantern-lit streets. Their eyes widened with wonder, but Clara always hushed them quickly, fearful that even words about another world might be considered dangerous. In this house, secrets nested within secrets. The wives carried knowledge that could never be spoken. Clara began to piece together fragments of conversations, noticing the way Sarah would fall silent whenever elders visited, or how Ruth would stare at the door long after footsteps faded away. There was something beneath the surface, something darker than polygamy, darker even than obedience. It was the threat of elimination. Clara remembered the words she had overheard. Another wife is gone, and they gnawed at her in the quiet hours of the night. She tried to push them from her mind, but the fear returned every time she saw the hollow look in Mary's eyes or the tension etched in Sarah's face. She realized that the wives had a bond unspoken, forged not from love, but from shared peril. They might not all trust each other, but they understood that survival meant keeping silent together. Still, Clara's youth and her outsider's spirit made silence hard to bear. She wanted to ask questions, to press Ruth about what she knew, to demand Sarah explain what the covenant truly meant. But the fear of discovery always held her tongue. To speak too much was to invite suspicion, and suspicion could lead to disappearance. One evening, as the house settled into uneasy quiet, Ruth slipped into Clara's room. Her eyes glimmered in the dim light of the lamp, her hands fidgeting as though she carried words too heavy to hold. She leaned close, her voice a whisper so soft Clara barely caught it. Do not trust the covenant. Do not trust even what you see. They say it is God's will, but it is men who choose who stays and who goes. Remember that. Clara's heart pounded, but before she could ask more, Ruth had gone, leaving only the echo of her warning. It was the first time anyone had spoken aloud what Clara already feared, that the eliminations were not acts of heaven, but of men. And if men controlled them, then no wife was safe. From that night onward, Clara saw the household differently. Every smile from the elders seemed like a mask. Every prayer in the meeting house felt like a chain being tightened. Even the quiet work of washing clothes or baking bread took on a new meaning, as if every action was a step in a game she had not chosen to play. She began to see herself not simply as a wife, but as a witness, someone living on the edge of a truth too dangerous to name. And though fear still bound her, there was a flicker of something else inside her now. It was not yet rebellion, not yet courage, but the beginning of a question. How long could one live in silence before silence itself became a kind of death? Clara first heard of the oath on a cold evening in late autumn, when the desert winds howled against the walls and the sky outside seemed to bruise with an approaching storm. She had been told to remain in the kitchen with Mary while the men gathered in the meeting room. But sound traveled easily in the small house, and through the thin walls she could hear voices rising and falling like a hymn gone sour. The words were muffled, yet certain phrases carried through clearly enough to lodge in her mind. Words like blood, secrecy, and purity. She glanced at Mary, who was stirring a pot over the fire with hands that trembled only slightly. Mary's face remained calm, but Clara saw the shadow in her eyes. She knew what the words meant, even if Clara did not. That night, when the men had gone, Mary finally spoke. She did not look at Clara as she said it, but her voice was soft, stripped of all pretense. They take an oath. To keep the covenant. To keep it even if it means spilling blood. Her lips pressed tight after the words, as if she had said too much, but Clara had already felt the weight of them. The oath was not symbolic. It was a promise enforced with fear, a bond written not in ink, but in the possibility of death. Days later, Clara witnessed the ritual for herself, though not by choice. The wives had been summoned to prepare the hall where the men would gather, laying out benches and lighting the lamps. When the meeting began, they were ordered to remain unseen behind a thin wooden partition. Through the cracks in the boards, Clara saw the faces of the elders lit by flickering lamplight. Their expressions were grave, their voices deep and solemn. A Bible rested on the table, but it was not the scripture they recited that struck Clara. It was the knife laid beside it, glinting in the firelight. One by one, the men placed their hands upon the book and spoke words that Clara could not fully hear. But she saw their gestures. Each pricked a finger with the knife, letting a drop of blood fall onto the table. The sight made Clara's stomach twist, but what chilled her most was the look in their eyes, a fervor that burned too brightly, a conviction that allowed no doubt. When Elder Nathaniel stepped forward to take his turn, Clara felt a wave of dread. This was her husband, the man who moved through her home with quiet authority. To the world, he was a shepherd of faith. But here, he was something else, bound by a blood oath that demanded obedience above all else. Ruth found Clara afterward, her face pale but her voice steady. "Now you see," she said. "This is the covenant. This is why we cannot speak. Their oath is stronger than love, stronger than family. It binds them to silence, and it binds us to fear." Clara wanted to ask how long this had been happening, how many oaths had been sworn before her arrival, how many wives had been erased in the name of purity. But Ruth only shook her head. "Do not ask. Questions are dangerous. Knowing too much is dangerous." Yet the seed of knowledge had been planted, and Clara could not turn away from it. She began to notice signs she had overlooked before. The way Sarah's lips tightened when the elders visited. The way Mary always seemed to pray longer after such meetings. The way Ruth grew restless, pacing like a caged animal. Each of them carried the knowledge of the oath. Each bore its weight in silence. One night, Clara dreamed of blood dripping onto the Bible, the red stains spreading across its pages until every word was drowned. She awoke gasping, her sheets damp with sweat. The dream clung to her like a warning. She began to wonder if the covenant's rituals were not just about loyalty, but about control, about ensuring that no one, not even the wives, could imagine a life beyond the walls of their faith. The days turned darker as winter set in. Snow blanketed the desert, muffling the world in silence. Inside the house, the fire burned low, and the wives wrapped themselves in shawls as they worked. Clara felt the air grow heavier with each passing day, as if the covenant's shadow stretched longer in the cold. She saw less of Nathaniel, but when he did come, his presence was heavier, his eyes more guarded. He spoke little to her, but when he did, his words carried the weight of warning. "Obedience brings safety," he said one evening, his hand resting on her shoulder. The pressure of his grip lingered long after he left the room. It was during that bleak winter that the first true disappearance struck, close to Clara. A woman from a nearby household, one she had met only once at the well, was suddenly gone. The story spread quickly. She had returned to her family in the east, the elders said. But Ruth's expression told another story. "No one leaves," she whispered to Clara when no one else was near. "No woman returns to the east. Once you are bound here, you do not escape." Her eyes were fierce, filled with a mixture of rage and terror. "They say she was unfaithful. They say she doubted. And now she is gone." Clara's heart hammered at the words. If elimination was the punishment for doubt, then every quiet question she carried in her mind was a step closer to disappearance. She began to move more carefully, watching every word she spoke, every glance she gave. Yet the fear only grew sharper. The blood oath bound the men together, but it also sealed the fate of the wives. Their silence was not just survival. It was demanded, enforced by the invisible threat of elimination. The longer Clara lived beneath its shadow, the more she realized that the covenant was not merely a set of rules. It was a weapon, and she, like the other wives, was both prisoner and target. The covenant demanded obedience, but human hearts rarely obey commands. Beneath the rigid silence of the household, emotions stirred like a river pressed beneath ice, unseen but powerful, threatening to crack the surface at any moment. Clara soon discovered that even in a world ruled by oaths and fear, love and desire found ways to exist in secret. It began innocently enough, in fleeting moments she could not control. Clara would see Samuel, the son of a neighboring settler, when she fetched water from the stream. He was no elder, no man of high standing in the church, but a farmer's boy of 20, strong from work, his hands rough but his smile disarmingly kind. He would nod politely as she passed, offering a word about the weather or a casual greeting. At first she thought little of it. But after months of isolation, of being seen only as a shadow within her own home, the simple recognition of her existence was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. She began to look for him without meaning to, her steps lingering at the stream longer than necessary, her heart racing when she heard his voice. She told herself it was nothing, that a smile, a glance, a brief exchange of words meant little. Yet in her dreams, Samuel's eyes replaced the cold stares of the elders. In her thoughts, he became the face of freedom, a reminder that she was more than a hidden wife. Ruth noticed before Clara could even admit it to herself. "You're playing a dangerous game," she whispered one evening as they folded linens together. Her voice carried neither judgment nor malice, only fear. "The covenant has ears everywhere. If they suspect you of straying, you won't just disappear, you'll be made an example." Clara flushed, denying it at first, but Ruth's knowing look silenced her. "I've seen it before," Ruth continued. "A glance can be enough. A word, a letter, a secret meeting, and suddenly she is gone. Do you want to end like that?" Clara shook her head, but the warnings only deepened the hunger inside her. It was not simply Samuel she longed for, but the life he represented, one of choice, of open affection, of being seen as a woman and not just a vessel bound by covenant. Still, she tried to bury her feelings, tried to obey the silence the wives lived under. But desire has its own will. One afternoon, when the snow was beginning to melt and the ground turned soft with mud, Clara went to the stream alone. Samuel was there, filling a bucket. He looked up as she approached, and for the first time his smile faltered. His eyes held something heavier, more dangerous than casual friendliness. He set down his bucket, straightened, and spoke in a voice low but urgent. "You shouldn't be here alone. They'll notice." Clara froze, her breath catching. "Why do you care?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because I see you," he said, and the words struck her like a blow. No one had ever said such a thing to her in this place. She wanted to deny it, to turn away, but instead she felt herself stepping closer, drawn by a force she could not resist. For a moment they stood in silence, the sound of the water rushing between them, until Samuel reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face. The touch was brief, almost accidental, but it burned in her skin long after. From that day, secrecy became heavier. Clara knew she should avoid the stream, but her feet carried her there again and again, drawn by something stronger than fear. Their conversations grew longer, their words more dangerous. Samuel spoke of the world beyond Utah, of rumors that the government might soon intervene in Mormon practices, of soldiers preparing to march west. Clara listened with wide eyes, her heart pounding with the thought that change might come from outside. Yet what mattered more than his words was the way he looked at her, not as a hidden wife, not as a shadow, but as a person. But the covenant had ways of sniffing out betrayal. It was Sarah who first warned her, though she spoke in riddles. "The walls are thin," she said one evening while they mended clothes. "If you have thoughts that do not belong here, bury them deep, for the ears of the covenant are always listening." Clara nodded silently, her stomach twisting. She did not know if Sarah suspected, or if she was merely repeating the lessons that kept them all alive. The danger grew sharper when Ruth confided a secret of her own. She, too, had once been tempted, once dreamed of escape with a man who promised her freedom. But the covenant had found out. "He vanished first," she said, her voice tight with pain. "They said he was a sinner, an outsider who threatened God's order. And then I was brought before the elders. They gave me a choice, silence or elimination." Her eyes glittered with unshed tears. "I chose silence, but I have been dead inside ever since." Clara could barely breathe as she listened. The covenant was not only watching the wives, but those who dared to care for them. Love itself was a crime punishable by disappearance. Yet even with Ruth's warning echoing in her ears, Clara could not snuff out the spark that Samuel had lit inside her. One night, when the household lay sleeping, Clara found a folded piece of paper tucked beneath her blanket. Her hands shook as she opened it, recognizing Samuel's handwriting. The note was simple, only a few words. "If you want to be free, meet me when the moon is full." Her heart raced as she read it over and over. Freedom. The word glowed in her mind like fire, both terrifying and intoxicating. But freedom came at a cost. If she went, if she was caught, the covenant would not hesitate. The blood oath bound the men, but its shadow fell upon the wives most of all. That night, Clara lay awake staring at the ceiling, torn between love and survival. The house was silent, but her mind roared with questions. Could she trust Samuel? Could she trust herself? Could she risk not only her life, but the lives of the other wives if her actions brought suspicion upon them? And yet, in the quiet hours before dawn, one truth settled into her bones. To remain was to die slowly, erased piece by piece until nothing of her was left. To leave was to risk elimination in an instant. Either way, the covenant had already marked her. The only choice left was whether she would go willingly into silence, or fight to claim her own voice before it was taken. The first disappearance close to Clara had unsettled her, but what followed turned unease into dread. The winter melted into spring, and with the thaw came whispers that spread through the settlement like a sickness. A wife from another household, a woman known for her defiant nature, was suddenly gone. Her name was not spoken in meetings, her presence erased from memory as though she had never existed. The elders told the people she had fallen ill and died quietly, but no grave was marked, no mourning allowed. The story did not settle. The wives whispered to one another at the wells, at the markets, in hurried snatches of conversation stolen from the watchful eyes of men. None of them believed she had died of sickness. They all knew she had been chosen. Chosen. That was the word Clara heard most often now, muttered with trembling lips. To be chosen was not a blessing, but a sentence. No one knew what became of the women taken. Some believed they were killed outright, their bodies buried in secret beneath the desert soil. Others thought they were sent far away, abandoned where no one would ever find them. A few even whispered of darker things, of rituals that demanded blood as payment for breaking the covenant. No one had proof, but proof was not necessary. The fear was real enough. In Clara's own home, the tension thickened. Sarah moved through the rooms with even sharper precision, her face unreadable, her voice clipped. Mary prayed longer each night, her whispered words drifting through the dark like a plea to be spared. Ruth grew restless, pacing, her eyes darting to the door as though expecting men to come for her at any moment. And Clara, carrying her secret letters from Samuel pressed beneath her mattress, felt the noose tighten around her. She knew if the covenant discovered her, she would not be spared. One evening, she overheard Nathaniel speaking with another elder just outside the window. Their voices were low, but the words carried clearly through the thin walls. "There is rot in the ranks," the other man said. "Some wives have begun to forget their place. The covenant cannot stand if disobedience spreads." Nathaniel's voice was calm, almost casual. "Then we remind them. A few eliminations now will preserve the whole." Clara pressed a hand against her mouth to stifle a gasp. The language of death was spoken as if it were housekeeping, as if lives were nothing more than items to be discarded when spoiled. That night, Clara dreamt of being dragged from her bed, of faceless men leading her into the desert, of the sand swallowing her voice until nothing remained. She woke shivering, her breath ragged, her heart pounding so loud she thought it might wake the others. For days afterward, she could not shake the image of her own disappearance. It was Ruth who broke the silence first. One afternoon, while Sarah and Mary were busy with the children, she pulled Clara into the root cellar and lit a small lamp. Her face glowed in the dim light, fierce but trembling. "It has begun again," she said. "Another wife from the South Village, gone. They said she left for her family, but I know the truth. She was eliminated." Her voice cracked on the word. "It will not stop. They are watching us, Clara. They are weighing us, deciding who stays and who vanishes. We are not wives to them. We are sacrifices." Clara felt her chest tighten. "Then what can we do?" she whispered. "If they choose us, then we die." Ruth finished, her eyes burning. "Unless we act before they can. Unless we find a way out." Her voice dropped lower still. "I have a plan, but it will cost everything." Clara stared at her, torn between hope and fear. Could escape truly be possible? Or was Ruth's desperation leading her into greater danger? She remembered Samuel's note, the promise of freedom beneath the full moon. Two paths stretched before her. One led into Ruth's rebellion, the other into Samuel's arms. Both were perilous, and both demanded she risk elimination. In the weeks that followed, the shadow of disappearance crept closer. Clara noticed the way Nathaniel looked at her sometimes, his gaze lingering too long, assessing. She wondered if he suspected her thoughts, her stolen glances at Samuel. Every word she spoke felt like it might betray her. Every gesture might be misread. The house no longer felt like shelter but a cage, its walls closing in tighter with each passing day. Then came the night when the covenant gathered again. Clara and the other wives were ordered to prepare the hall. The men's voices carried with solemn weight, and the knife glinted once more beside the Bible. Clara pressed her eye to the crack in the partition and watched as each man renewed his blood oath. The ritual was the same as before, but this time the words chilled her to the bone. "We preserve the covenant with life and with blood. We erase what threatens us. We eliminate what corrupts us." The words struck like blows. The wives, she realized, were not just bound by silence. They were offerings, their lives measured against the covenant's endurance. When the ritual ended, Nathaniel lingered behind with two other elders. Clara strained to hear them. One of the men spoke in a hushed voice, but the words were clear enough. "3 names have been marked. By the next gathering, they will be gone." Clara's blood ran cold. 3 names. She did not know if hers was among them, but the certainty of elimination pressed down on her like a weight. That night, Ruth came to her again. Her voice was urgent, her hands gripping Clara's tightly. "It is happening. They are choosing now. We have little time. If we wait, we will be next." Clara stared at her, terror and resolve warring inside. For the first time, she felt the truth with absolute clarity. The covenant was not a shield of faith, but a blade hanging over them all. And if she did nothing, it would fall. The shadow of elimination was no longer rumor. It was real, imminent, and it had already claimed too many. Clara knew then that silence would not save her. Only action could. Ruth's words stayed with Clara long after the lamp was extinguished. The thought of rebellion had always seemed impossible, a fantasy whispered in secret and then quickly buried. But now, with 3 wives marked for elimination, the choice was no longer whether to risk rebellion. It was whether to accept death in silence. The following days were filled with coded exchanges, glances that lingered too long, whispers shared in the dead of night. Ruth became the quiet leader, her fire giving shape to desperate hope. Mary, hesitant at first, eventually joined them, her hands trembling as she confessed that she could not bear to see her daughters grow up in a world where women vanished without trace. Even Sarah, who had always clung most tightly to obedience, allowed herself to be drawn in. "I have lived my life in silence," she said one evening, her voice low and heavy. "But I will not die that way." Together, they began to weave a fragile plan. They spoke of escape routes, of gathering small supplies unnoticed, of finding allies outside the settlement. Clara thought of Samuel, of his note hidden beneath her mattress, and wondered if he might be the key. But she dared not tell the others yet, not until she was certain he would not betray them. Trust was as dangerous as fear in a world ruled by oaths. The wives began to test the boundaries of their captivity in subtle ways. Sarah lingered longer at the market, speaking quietly with women from other households. Mary traded small pieces of cloth for information. Ruth ventured near the outer edges of the settlement, where travelers passed through. Each act was small, insignificant on its own, but together they formed the skeleton of something larger, a rebellion born not of swords or fire, but of whispered defiance. Clara found her courage growing in unexpected places. One night, when Nathaniel demanded her presence, she forced herself to look into his eyes without flinching. She said little, but the act of holding his gaze felt like rebellion enough. She realized that rebellion was not only in running away, but in refusing to let the covenant erase her spirit before her body. The more they conspired, the more the wives began to trust one another in ways they never had before. Bonds formed in the shadows, woven out of fear but strengthened by hope. They shared secrets they had never dared to speak aloud. Ruth confessing her lost love, Mary admitting her doubts about God's will, Sarah revealing that she, too, had once considered escape before duty bound her back. Clara listened, her heart aching with the realization that every woman here carried a hidden wound, each scar cut by the same blade. But rebellion was not without risk. Twice, they nearly exposed themselves. Once, when an elder entered the kitchen unexpectedly and found Sarah and Ruth whispering too closely. Another time, when one of Mary's daughters asked an innocent question aloud about the plan Mama spoke of. The women covered their tracks quickly, but the brush with exposure left them shaken. Still, they pressed forward. Ruth insisted that their strength lay not only in secrecy, but in solidarity. "They can silence one of us," she said, "but not all of us if we stand together." Clara wanted to believe her, though doubt gnawed at the edges of her hope. She had seen the power of the covenant, the way it erased women from existence as easily as sweeping dust from the floor. As the full moon drew closer, the night Samuel had promised freedom, Clara felt her heart split between two loyalties. One to the women who had become her sisters in silence, bound together by shared peril. The other to Samuel, whose promise of escape shimmered like a dream just out of reach. She knew she would soon have to choose. And beneath it all, the shadow of elimination loomed ever nearer. The wives could feel it in the way the elders watched them, in the tightening of rules, in the whispers that another round of selections was coming. Time was slipping away. If they did not act soon, rebellion would not matter. They would simply vanish, names erased, voices silenced. For the first time, Clara understood what it meant to carry both fear and hope in the same breath. Fear of being chosen, and hope that maybe, just maybe, They could break free before the covenant consumed them all. The night of the eliminations began like any other, which only made the dread heavier. The settlement was quiet beneath the pale glow of the moon, the desert wind sweeping softly against wooden walls. But inside every household, hearts beat faster, breaths were shallow, and wives clung to their children as though it might be the last time. Clara sat awake, the letter from Samuel pressed in her palm. Tonight was the night he had promised. Tonight, he would be waiting beyond the edge of the settlement, where the dry riverbed curved toward the mountains. But even as she thought of escape, she knew that something darker stirred within the covenant's walls. Near midnight, the knock came. Heavy, deliberate, echoing through the house like a death toll. Nathaniel rose without hesitation, pulling on his coat, his face grim but resolute. "Stay," he commanded the wives. "Do not follow." His footsteps faded into the night, swallowed by silence. Moments later, the screams began. They were muffled, distant, but enough to send terror racing through Clara's veins. She rushed to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she peered into the shadows. She saw lanterns moving in the dark, figures dragging someone between them. A woman's voice, sharp, desperate, pierced the night before being silenced abruptly. The sound chilled Clara to her core. Ruth appeared at her side, her face pale, but her eyes burning. "It's begun," she whispered. "They've started the eliminations." The wives gathered in the dim room, clutching one another. No one spoke for several long moments, the silence broken only by the muffled cries outside. Mary held her daughters close, rocking them back and forth, her prayers tumbling over one another in frantic whispers. Sarah stood rigid, her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles turned white. Clara's mind raced. Samuel would be waiting, but how could she leave the others behind? How could she abandon them to the covenant's cruelty? Yet if she stayed, she risked becoming one of the eliminated before dawn. Ruth gripped her arm suddenly. "This is our moment. If we go now, while they are distracted, while they are killing, we might escape." Her words were harsh, urgent, stripped of softness. She was right. The men were occupied, their attention fixed on the ritual of death. The chaos outside could be their only chance. Clara hesitated, torn between terror and resolve. The screams outside grew fainter, replaced by chanting, low, guttural, rising and falling in rhythm. A ritual, she realized, a dark covenant being fed with blood. Her decision crystallized. Whether with Samuel or alone, whether with the other wives or carrying their hope within her, she could not remain. Tonight, one way or another, her fate would be decided beneath the same moon that illuminated both freedom and death. She turned to Ruth, to Mary, to Sarah, her voice trembling but firm. "Then we move now, before they come for us." And together, with the covenant's knife still wet under the moonlight, the wives prepared to gamble everything on escape. The night air cut cold against Clara's skin as she and the other wives slipped from the house, their steps careful but quick. The lanterns flickered far in the distance, the men still gathered around whatever cruel ritual they had begun. The desert stretched before them, endless and uncertain, but tonight it looked less like a prison and more like a promise. Mary carried her youngest on her hip, the child's face buried in her shoulder, while her other daughter clung tightly to Sarah's hand. Ruth led the way, her jaw set, her eyes sharp with determination. Clara followed close behind, her heart pounding as though each beat might give them away. Every sound, the crunch of sand underfoot, the whistle of the wind, the cry of an owl, felt like a warning that discovery was near. At the dry riverbed, Clara's breath caught. A shadow moved beneath the pale moonlight. For a heartbeat, fear paralyzed her, until the figure stepped forward and she saw Samuel. His face, tense but alive with urgency, lit up at the sight of her. "You came," he whispered, reaching for her hand. The warmth of his touch steadied her racing pulse. But Ruth was not swayed by reunion. "We don't have time for tenderness," she hissed. "They will realize soon, and when they do, they will hunt us." Samuel nodded grimly. "She's right. There's a wagon hidden beyond the ridge. Supplies, water, enough to get us past the canyon. But we must hurry." The group pressed forward, their shadows long against the sand. Every step felt like defiance, every breath an act of rebellion. Clara glanced back once, the settlement shrinking behind them, its dark rooftops silhouetted against the glowing sky. She thought of the women already taken, their voices erased. For them, she promised herself, she would survive. They were halfway across the ridge when the sound split the silence. Dogs barking, men shouting, the thundering rhythm of boots against earth. The Covenant had discovered their absence. "Run!" Samuel barked. The wives clutched their skirts, lifting them high as they scrambled over rocks and loose sand. Mary stumbled, but Sarah hauled her forward, determination giving strength to her thin frame. Ruth turned once, her face set with defiance, and shouted into the night, "We will not be your sacrifices." Arrows hissed through the air, one striking the ground dangerously close. Panic surged, but so did resolve. Clara tightened her grip on Samuel's hand, forcing herself onward even as her lungs burned and her legs screamed for rest. At last, the wagon came into sight, its wheels half buried in shadow. Samuel helped the women climb aboard, urging the horses forward with desperate speed. The wagon lurched, wheels grinding against stone as it barreled toward the canyon. Behind them, torches blazed and voices carried, furious and relentless. As the canyon walls swallowed them in darkness, Clara knew the Covenant would not stop hunting. They had escaped the knife tonight, but freedom carried its own price. Endless running, endless fear, a life carved out in shadows. And yet, as she held Samuel's hand and felt Ruth, Sarah, and Mary breathing beside her, she also felt something new, the fragile, precious weight of hope. For the first time since entering the Covenant's walls, Clara allowed herself to believe in a future beyond silence. A future paid for with courage, sacrifice, and blood, but a future nonetheless. The desert stretched endlessly, an ocean of sand and stone that swallowed every sound except the creak of the wagon wheels and the labored breaths of the horses. For hours, none of them spoke. Fear clung to them, heavy and suffocating, as though the Covenant's shadow still reached across the miles. Clara sat pressed against Samuel, her body aching but her spirit alive in a way it had never been before. Every bump of the road reminded her she was free, or at least freer than she had been hours ago. Ruth broke the silence first. "They will not stop," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "The Covenant hunts what it cannot control. They will paint us as traitors, sinners. To them, our freedom is rebellion against God himself." Mary clutched her daughters closer, kissing the tops of their heads. "Then let them chase us," she whispered. "I'd rather run forever than see my girls vanish into that darkness." Sarah, who had been silent the longest, finally raised her eyes to the horizon. "Maybe that is what freedom is," she murmured. "Not peace, not safety, but the choice to keep living when they would rather see us erased." Clara listened, her heart swelling with a mix of sorrow and resolve. She thought of the wives who had not made it out, of the names never spoken, the graves never marked. Their absence was a wound that would never heal, but it was also a fire that drove her forward. Each mile they put between themselves and the Covenant was a mile stolen back from silence. As dawn began to wash the desert in pale light, Samuel guided the wagon off the main trail toward a cluster of boulders. "We'll rest here," he said. "The horses need water, and so do we." They climbed down stiffly, stretching limbs sore from the frantic ride. Mary's daughters curled up together beneath a blanket, exhaustion dragging them into sleep. Ruth walked to the edge of the rocks, scanning the horizon with sharp eyes. Clara could see the question in her stance. Were they far enough? Would they ever be? Samuel placed a hand on Clara's shoulder. "There's a settlement a few days' ride north," he said softly. "People there don't answer to the Covenant. We could start again. Quietly. Safely." The words sounded like a promise, but Clara knew safety was fragile. The Covenant's reach was long, its memory longer. Yet for the first time, she felt the possibility of shaping her own life, of choosing her path rather than having it chosen for her. She looked at Ruth, at Mary, at Sarah, at the sleeping children, and realized they were bound together now by more than fear. They were bound by survival, by rebellion, by the refusal to disappear. As the sun rose higher, Clara whispered to herself, "We are still here." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of every woman silenced before her. She would carry their memory forward, not as victims of elimination, but as voices that could no longer be erased. The Covenant had taken their past, but the future was theirs to claim. And though freedom's price was steep, it was a price Clara was willing to pay. 3.